Blessings, good evening to you all. It's Tuesday night, so that means we have a question and answer session. The wild weather has calmed down a bit, which is good. We had a lot of wind, trees coming down, rain, flooding in the Yarra Valley, so hopefully the wild weather will pass. It's always a reminder of the uncertainties of life. Who can control the weather? So we have a few questions tonight. The first one is, Luang Por, could you please explain the 5 khandhas and papancha, mental proliferation? Well, the 5 khandhas means 5 groups, 5 categories, and it's the way the Buddha described a human being. The Buddha encouraged us to train our minds in wise reflection and a certain amount of analytical thinking, breaking things down, because he saw that the root cause of human being suffering is the attachment to this self-identity view, sense of self, seeing a solid, substantial self in this body and this mind, when in fact, a human being, a human person is made up of these different component parts, or these 5 khandhas, all of which are, we say, conditioned things that arise due to causes and conditions, pass away, and a solid, lasting self cannot be found in them. So he would describe a person as made up of these 5 groups or categories of experience to help us to understand that truth, to break things down as we contemplate and come to understand the deeper truths, deeper reality of existence. So the first khandha is the rupa khandha, form. So that's form as in our physical body, the material body made up of material elements, but obviously refers to form externally as well, so other people's bodies and the material world around us. Then the next 4 khandhas or groups are mental, what we call nama Dhamma, mentality. So there's Vedana, which means feeling. They say the tone of our experience, so pleasant, unpleasant, or neither pleasant nor unpleasant, so neutral. So 3 kinds of feeling, which one or the other of these 3 kinds of feelings is arising at any moment of our experience, through the day, through our life. The next of the mental khandhas is sanya, which means perception. So the way we remember things, the way we perceive our experience through our senses. So it's partly based on past experience, how we've remembered things, the features, the symbols and signs and images that we remember and the importance we attribute to them. It's how our mind picks up perception and learns perceptions. It doesn't mean to say we always perceive things correctly or wisely, but it's a function of mind going on all the time. The next of the groups is the sankhara khandha, which is the kind of active of the mental khandhas. It's in particular, it's where we make karma, because karma originates in the mind, and the sankhara khandha means mental formations, and particularly led by intention or volition. But they can be wholesome or unwholesome. So mental formations, the contents of the mind and the qualities of the mind, the mental states that we create. So it could be, for example, mindfulness or faith or loving kindness. We just chanted the reflection on universal loving kindness. So you bring up the thought, may I be well, may all beings be well, free from suffering. So that's a mental formation of the wholesome, skillful category, as opposed to, say, the mental formation rooted in ill will, which would be an expression of aversion towards a person or an experience we have, or maybe solidifying into hatred. I hate you, I hate them. So mental formations can be skillful, wholesome or unwholesome. And the last of the khandhas is the vijnana khandha, which means consciousness. So the consciousness, the knowing that arises with eye consciousness, of seeing, and then hearing, tasting, touching, smelling. And the mind itself is one form of consciousness. We know, we cognize with our mind, we have thoughts and ideas. So the 5 khandhas are how you can split up human experience for contemplation, both our own khandhas and then the khandhas of other people, internal or external. And they can be high and lofty and superior, or they can be very coarse, they can be near, far, internal, external, and so on. But they're ways that the Buddha categorized experience to help us to talk about it and to focus mindfulness and wise reflection to learn the truth about these things. So sometimes he called the 5 khandhas the papancha upadana khandha. So adding the word upadana meaning the basis for clinging, basis for identity view. So for the enlightened one, they've contemplated and learnt and established mindfulness over and over again to the point where they see these khandhas are not self. They're anicca, dukkha, anatta. So they're impermanent, they're unsatisfactory, they're not self. So they have no more upadana, no more clinging to the khandhas. So that sense of self in experience is gone for the enlightened one. But the unenlightened person keeps creating a sense of self, attaching to form, feelings, memories, thought formation, sense consciousness. And this is where we suffer. So the khandhas themselves are just what they are. They're just thoughts, feelings, memories, form, body. The suffering comes from the attachment to them with a sense of self. So if one's mindfulness and insight is clear, and you might say perfect, then that sense of self dissolves. One sees them just as conditioned experiences, part of nature. They are just what they are. No more suffering. So the Buddha didn't encourage us to destroy the khandhas. He encouraged us to understand them, to know them as they are, and remove the delusion, the ignorance, the delusion that underlies the khandhas. So when we're not very mindful, we're not aware, when delusion is there and the sense of self is there, it manifests as what we call papancha. This is a term which means mental proliferation or diffuseness of mind, or the mind that just spreads and complicates experience. And papancha is made up of 3 main mental qualities. That is ditthi, the attachment to views, in particular wrong views, wrong beliefs about the world, about oneself. Mana, which means conceit, so the attachment to the sense of self, I, me, mine. And tanha, which is craving for sense objects, craving to become, craving not to become. These 3 qualities combine together, fueled by not knowing the truth, fueled by unawareness, and they create mental proliferation out of our experience. So how does it arise? Well, you see something, you hear something which brings a sight, a a sound into consciousness, and with that you get a perception arising and vedana, pleasant, neutral, unpleasant. And if we're not mindful and clear at that moment, and there's no insight into the impermanence, the unsatisfactoriness and the lack of self in that moment, that experience at that moment, papancha begins, mental proliferation begins. So you see something that you like, so you see something on TV, say you see some nice food on TV, you're watching MasterChef. I've never watched MasterChef in my life, but I assume you watch MasterChef and you see some nice food, and it's straight away may lead to some diffuseness or this mental proliferation of mind. Oh, I like that. What is that? It looks good. What's it? What are the ingredients? I wonder how it tastes. How do you cook it? I want to get the recipe for that, etc. And off the mind goes, looking at some nice food. You haven't even tasted it yet, but you're just seeing it already. The mind starts to proliferate, for example. So we proliferate about pleasant things, and we proliferate about unpleasant experiences. So something painful happens. You get a pain, a twinge in your body. Somewhere you get a pain and you start worrying, oh, what is that? What is that pain? What's the cause? Have I got some illness, some injury? What is it? And off the mind goes. So this process of mental proliferation is going on much of the time. When we're not mindful and aware, we tend to proliferate about things. So it's a big area of learning and study and focus of mindfulness and wisdom in our practice is to observe mental proliferation, observe the agitating nature of it, the suffering of it, and that gives us some impetus to want to establish mindfulness and drop it, let it go. And you'll notice when you're mindful, the mind doesn't proliferate so much, or maybe doesn't proliferate at all. You still may see that nice looking food on MasterChef, but you just see the image and you know what it is, and then you leave it right there, rather than picking up for a lot of thinking, proliferating that agitates the mind. So mental proliferation is, anyone who practices meditation will have to deal with lots of mental proliferation about pleasant things and unpleasant things based on views and opinions, based on sense desire, based on desire to get things, want things, or to get rid of things. And that's just that basic conceit, sense of self, pride. Conceit tends to lead to a lot of comparing with other people, comparing with our ideals. I'm good enough, I'm not good enough, and so on. So, it's the experience of suffering is often synonymous with mental proliferation. So when we practice meditation, we're looking into that and looking at ways to catch mental proliferation and recognize it for what it is and start to let it go. So when people say they teach you to let go, well, you're letting go of all that additional suffering that we add on to experience through mental proliferation. In the end, seeing is just seeing, hearing is just hearing, but then we add on to it, we proliferate about it. So that's a good area to look into in your meditation. Another question, Lumpur. We're taught to let go of grasping onto the 5 khandhas. But for example, if we see a nice view of the ocean and the perception comes up that it is beautiful, is it okay for us to think it is beautiful and smile, but shortly afterwards we let go of grasping onto this perception? Or is it better if we immediately let go of the grasping of this perception? Which approach should we take? Well, this is very closely linked to the last question. Well, with the best will in the world, if the mind is not trained well in mindfulness and insight, even if you want to immediately let go of the grasping, you might not be able to, because of the power of craving and attachment, habit, karmic habit. So seeing the view of the ocean, that's your resultant karma. Like these 5 khandhas are a result of past karma, our past actions, both in this life and in previous lives. The body, the feelings that are arising, the sense contact we're having, good and bad, what we're seeing, hearing, tasting, touching, this is all karma coming back to us every moment of the day. But then at the same time, there's the active part of the khandhas, particularly that sankhara khandha, the mental formations, is reacting to things all the time. So our old karma comes up. So maybe you have some wholesome old karma arising that you've got yourself to a spot next to the ocean. And it may be a beautiful evening, the sun is setting, the sea looks wonderful, so you're having that good view. That's the result of your good past karma getting you to that point where you have that nice experience of seeing the view. So in a sense, that's okay, that's fine. That's nothing new, that's just your old karma coming up. But what happens next will be your sankhara khandha will react to it. There'll be the pleasant feeling, the perception, maybe, like you said, I like this, pleasant feeling. What happens next? So if you're mindful, you can be mindful and know, oh, pleasant feeling, pleasant perception, nice ocean view. And like you say, then you just let it be. Because with mindfulness, you're also able to reflect, it's impermanent. Views don't last forever, they change. The conditions that lead up to these views change. You don't stand there all night watching the view, it gets dark maybe, and then the view is gone. Or the weather changes and you have to move away. The wind comes, the rain comes, it changes. Or something else interrupts your view. So you know it's impermanent. The sight is impermanent, the feeling is impermanent. With mindfulness, you can reflect like that. So you still see the view and enjoy the pleasure of it. But then you know it's impermanent, so you drop it, let it go. And what's impermanent cannot be a self. If your insight at that moment is clear, you know the eyes seeing don't belong to anyone. They're a product, they're rupa Dhamma, a product of past karma. They are not a self in themselves. The seeing, the eye consciousness is not a self, it's consciousness. And that's a big call. The average meditator is not yet seeing consciousness as not self, but ultimately that's the goal of the practice, is to look into our experience until we do see even consciousness is not a self, it's just the quality of knowing. And we're dropping the attachment to self that might form. So there's many aspects to the experience of looking at the ocean and seeing a beautiful view. Is craving arising? It's that point where the Vedana, the pleasant feeling, arises with the perception, nice view like this. Does it go into craving straight away? If you're not aware, it will. And there'll be a subtle craving. I like this, I want more of this, this is good. Craving conditions upadana, clinging. So you might start to form a view that looking at the ocean is good, and I want to be in a situation where I can look at the ocean whenever I want in the future. But you're also setting yourself up for becoming and then ultimately for suffering. So maybe one day you can't see the ocean when you want to, so you get frustration, despair. Or your eyes fade and one day you get so ill you can't see anymore, so you can't see the ocean in old age, and it's like, oh, I used to enjoy watching the ocean, now I can't even see it, because eyes are impermanent, eye consciousness is therefore impermanent, and it's not self. There's many questions, many things to learn from the simple experience of the eye seeing the ocean and enjoying the pleasure of it, if we are reflecting on it in the way the Buddha encouraged us to learn from our experience, and particularly to see the train of causal conditions that lead from feeling that's arising with the perception and the sense contact, the pleasant feeling in this situation, leading on to craving, clinging, becoming, birth. So we call it a little birth. You're not born as a human being at that moment, but you're born into the pleasure of seeing. So the Buddha pointed out that life is a mixture of pleasant and unpleasant experiences, and all of that is coming back to you as your karma, but our aim is to develop magga, the path of sila, samadhi, panya, and particularly developing mindfulness, samadhi, so we have a foundation of calm, steadiness of mind, so we can reflect on those experiences. So even the Buddha may have seen a beautiful lake or ocean, but he wouldn't have attached to it because he knows it's anicca, dukkha, anatta. It's impermanent, it's not self. So it wouldn't prompt craving in his mind. Seeing the beautiful view, he knows it's a beautiful view. He knows the characteristic of beauty. He's not denying it or hiding it, but he's not identifying with it through craving and attachment. And that's our goal in practice, is to remove identity view that attaches to the khandhas as self, to this experience as self. So we have to practice in mindfulness and reflection, wise reflection on our experience, to root out the causes of suffering. How quickly we let go of the grasping, how well we're practiced in mindfulness, and some things we grasp at and can drop quickly, immediately. Other things stick with us, don't they? They linger in our mind, and so we have mental proliferation about them. They linger on, maybe long after you've left the ocean, you're on your way home or whatever, you're still remembering it and thinking about it, going back over the past. So you can see how the more powerful kind of attachments we build up just keep reoccurring in our experience because we're not yet clear enough and seeing the impermanence of that attachment, so we're not yet dropping it. So there's plenty of opportunity for work there. But it doesn't mean to say we can't have pleasant experiences, but the question is, how do we treat them in terms of our practice? There's another question. Why do monks not accept or use money? The Buddha pointed out there's two main dangers for a monk: females and money, because they stimulate so much desire and attachment. They're not the only dangers, but they're two very important dangers. Sexual desire is very powerful. So to have enough mindfulness and insight to see sexual desire as anicca, dukkha, anatta, and see the object of the desire as anicca, dukkha, anatta requires a lot of practice, a lot of training. So one has to be very restrained and careful around something that arouses such powerful emotions in the mind. And the same with money. Money arouses a lot of powerful emotions, desire and attachment. We say money makes the world go round. So monks are still human beings. You come into the robes, you haven't yet abandoned all your craving and attachment, so money may still be a draw on your mind, sitting there in the back of your mind through past conditioning. As we know, money itself is just paper, coins. It may not have that much intrinsic value, but it's the value people put on it. What creates craving and attachment, leads to all kinds of human behavior which we're aware of. It's a big, important part of our mental landscape, and then the world runs and on money. One of the things I remember when I was a very small kid was hearing a story about how just after the First World War, it shows you how old I am. I wasn't old enough to participate in any of the world wars, but I had relatives who did, and someone was telling me about how the economy collapsed in parts of Europe after the First World War, and people used cigarettes as money because paper money lost its value. And it really struck me, kind of still sticks in my mind, just this sort of wonder, like, oh, money it's really how much value you put on something, and then how much importance you give to it, and that's an agreed thing in society as well. It's not just an individual thing. Everyone has to agree. So even cigarettes can become money. And people would push wheelbarrows of cigarettes down the road to go and buy things in the shops because the money no longer had value, so the cigarettes were more useful for that. Later on, when I travelled in countries where there was a lot of economic collapse, and you would often the money in those countries had no real value. It was almost worth nothing, and you'd have to use foreign currency to try and get any kind of buy anything or get anything done. So again, it was a reinforcing that sense. Money really depends how we view it. Depends on the people and the situation. It doesn't have that much intrinsic value in itself. It's just paper notes or whatever. But for monks, we are here to practice for nibbana, liberation of the mind from greed, anger, delusion, and money is a basis for greed and attachment. There's that well-known story of the monk who came to stay with Ajahn Chah and said, I want to come and practice with you. I've been using money, because some monks use money, even though strictly speaking we're not allowed to. We have rules preventing us from using money, but some still do. And he said, I want to stay here. I've got some money, but I'll just keep it because I'm not attached to it. Is that all right? And Ajahn Chah said, well, if you can find me some salt that's not salty, then I'll allow you to keep your money. Meaning, if you keep money and no greed arises, then I'll let you keep it, which is pretty much impossible, because money is a basis for greed. We've had so much greed for it in the past, unwittingly, unknowingly, or knowingly. To keep money, if you are a monk, you'll just see it come up straight away. So to cut all that off and to really focus our minds on the path towards liberation, the Buddha said, no, monks don't need money. And in a way, it kind of liberates you from the world, doesn't it? You don't handle money, you don't have to think about it, you don't have to spend all that time thinking about it. You're free from greed and attachment to it, worries about it. You as a layperson, how much suffering is associated with money, getting it, how you're going to get it, how you're going to keep it, how you're going to spend it, what are you going to do when you don't have any, and so on. Endless. There's no end to it. So it's liberating to give up that use of money. Of course, it gives rise to a great sense of not knowing, insecurity. Oh, no money, how am I going to survive? So you have to trust in Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha. And luckily, the Sangha has been around for 2,500 years, so you can see, well, other people have lived without money, so I probably can. That's how you can think about it. And people who come into the Sangha, monks and nuns, if they have a basis in discipline and some faith, well, they can push through those concerns about the lack of money. And you're focusing your mind on the higher things, the development of sila, samadhi, panya, and the happiness one gets from the practice balances the mind and is a much deeper, more profound kind of happiness. So it doesn't matter that you're letting go of money. It's a kind of happiness money can't buy, and the more you practice, the more you realize that, the less importance money, making money, earning money and collecting wealth has to you, because it's not the source of your real happiness. Wisdom is the source of real happiness, and wisdom has to come through the practice, through the experience of the practice. So then the more you practice, the more easy it is just to not think or worry about money. It also means the monks are dependent on the laity, at least for the basics of life, for food, clothing. We don't have many possessions, but by not using money, it means we have to keep close to the lay community because we still need the basic needs of life, food and basic accommodations. So we're dependent on the kindness, the generosity, the compassion of laity. And that has a good effect. It means the monks tend to be more humble, well-behaved, because if you're not well-behaved, then people won't want to feed you. So not having money has a very good effect on the mind spiritually. It humbles you, changes your perspective on life, helps you to rid the mind of a lot of craving and attachment, simplifies things, keeps you poor and therefore not a burden on people, and so on. So it has many, many good effects on the Sangha, on the laity, and on the individual for their practice. Another question. How can we help our kids stay in touch with Dhamma during lockdown? That's a good question. Kids, quite a range there. You're not specifying an age group, so that we have 3, 4, 5-year-old kids, and then we have 16, 17-year-old kids, and they're quite different. But one thing that helps with kids or even adults, to help other people in their practice or to keep in touch with Dhamma, number one, we have to practice Dhamma. We have to put our own efforts into our own practice, both as an example and to gain an experience and understanding that we may then pass on or share to others. Difficult to expect your kids to have an interest in Dhamma, in any form of Dhamma, if we're not doing it. So you want your kids to learn mindfulness or meditation. If we don't meditate, then they won't get that sense that it's an important thing. You can tell them, or you come to a monk and say, tell them, but you have to practice as well, then they might value it. Listening to the Dhamma is the same. If we don't listen to the Dhamma, then they're less likely to. So seeing that value of being an example, a Kalyana Mitta, a good friend, a noble, true friend to your children, is a good starting point. And then you also have to look at their needs, say, based on their age, I'd say. So with very young kids, how did the Buddha start teaching his own young son? Well, he taught him about the importance of not lying, of being honest and loving truth, and understanding karma, that our actions have consequences. I can remember when I was a kid at infant school, when I was only like 5, 6 years old, teachers would often say things that were very Buddhist, even though they weren't Buddhist teachers, but they'd say things like, if you hurt someone else with your words, they're going to feel sad, angry, they're not going to be happy, just as if someone else hurts you, they insult you, they're rude to you, you don't feel happy. And they'd get us to think like that, if you hit someone else, they're hurt, just as you don't like being hit, they don't like being hit. That's the way I was taught at school, or my parents as well. So it's just teaching us the most basic thing about karma, isn't it? And that's a principle that you can use all the way through your life. So the more you can get them to think about karma, the more you can help give them some structure or some principles to help them understand how they're going to relate to the world as they go to school, meet other people, or just at home in the family, even with little creatures. If you don't like people hurting you, well, don't hurt bugs, don't hurt little birds or animals, frogs, whatever it is that kids like to hurt. Because we don't like it, well, don't do it to them. That principle is very useful, and I think as soon as kids start to think and talk, then you can start talking about that. Because they will have problems, won't they? Kids fight, they argue, they do make karma from a young age. So finding skillful ways to give them some reflection on karma, on the value of precepts, the principles behind the 5 precepts. So reading stories when they're young, reading stories to them, I think is a really good thing to do. Buddhist literature, Buddhist cartoons, movies, apps and things can help. Practicing it yourself, talking to them about it, but not forcing. You can't force these things on kids, but you can discuss them, Buddhist teachings and practices with them. And then maybe from a young age, encouraging them to do a little bit of meditation here and there in their day, maybe before they go to school in the morning or at night before they go to bed, to do a meditation on loving kindness, if only for 1 or 2 minutes, and you can sit with them and explain to them and run through as a guided meditation, developing thoughts of kindness to themselves, to others. So even in lockdown you can still do that, can't you? You can still read things to them, they can still listen to Dhamma teaching that is enjoyable for their age group, and you can sit meditation with them, can encourage them to practice good speech when they're online, if they're learning online and interacting with other kids and the teacher, you know, encourage some principles of Dhamma there, right speech, good speech, kindness, forgiveness. You can introduce that whether they're at home or out of lockdown. As kids get older, of course, you have to talk to them more like adults. Once they're teenagers, well, you can maybe share some of your experiences from your own practice with them, how you deal with problems of interacting with different kinds of people who like you, people who don't like you, dealing with illness, dealing with frustrations and failures. Whatever you've learned, if you are practicing the Dhamma, whatever you've heard, whatever you've learned in your meditation, whatever you've learned in trying to keep precepts, you can pass that on to them. But you can't force it, but you can share. If you put time and effort into that, you can learn ways to share your experience with your kids. And as I said, the best thing is be a good example, so they are seeing that, because especially teenagers, well, they often don't want to talk to their parents very much, but they're still maybe living with you and seeing how you're living. So there's plenty of room for creativity, especially in lockdown, but trying to practice it yourself and introduce some of these principles of karma, good karma, bad karma, the value of precepts, the value of metta meditation particularly, and doing some with them would be a good starting point. We have to learn to enjoy Dhamma, especially for kids, so that's why you can't force it and you can't make them like Dhamma. You have to introduce it in a way that is light on their mind, easy, acceptable, and try and keep that in the back of your mind. You know, if you're just trying to force them to do something, well, they may react and go against that. So it takes a bit of thought, I think. You know, think it through how to help the kids. The last question: how do we know when to contemplate and when to focus on the breath during meditation? The same old question. This comes up all the time, doesn't it? And it's pointing to the 2 parts of meditation. There's the development of insight through contemplation, observation, wise reflection. And there's you might say, the basic action of samatha, developing mindfulness on an object, say the breath, learning to pay attention mindfully to an object. And these 2 aspects of meditation we're developing together in the one mind, and you know, you can't be absolutely strict on this and say you divide your time and do this much with focusing on the breath and then spend this much time contemplating. Sometimes nature takes the lead and your mind is naturally calm, so contemplation is easier and more successful. Then there's other times when your mind is not calm at all and it's very scattered or confused or sleepy, and you may have to find ways to just bring up mindfulness to cut through the scattered nature of the mind, the discursive thinking, or the sleepiness. So there has to be a little bit of adaptability and willingness to see what's needed and to observe your mind, and also to experiment sometimes. So sometimes your mind can contemplate. Like Ajahn Chah, they asked this question to Ajahn Chah, and he said, well, when your mind is calm enough that you can contemplate, then contemplate. And you'll notice naturally sometimes your mind feels quite calm, not just when you're meditating, but at any time in your day. You may feel quite at ease, quite calm, and that's a good time to bring up an aspect of the Dhamma in your experience at that moment, or a theme that you've been thinking about before. Maybe you bring it up and you investigate it and contemplate. That could be when you're sitting in a car as a passenger, just sitting there, or waiting for somebody, or just walking down the road. You can contemplate in many different situations, but when your mind feels quite calm. Other times you may have stronger emotions or a lot of very agitated mental activity going on. Well, maybe at that time you can't contemplate. That's a time to calm the mind down, just using basic mindfulness, turning to the breath, turning to the posture as you walk, whatever the situation is. So you have to observe yourself and see what's needed or what's appropriate at different times, whether it's in one meditation setting or throughout your day. But we always need mindfulness, so it tends to be the way teachers will begin teaching. You say, well, establish mindfulness on the breath. That's kind of your beginning point. But then you see how much effort you need to put into establishing mindfulness on the breath, how easy it is, how difficult it is, and whether you need to contemplate to support that, or forget the contemplation, just put all the effort into establishing mindfulness. Or sometimes you're becoming more naturally mindful and you can turn to contemplate. And Ajahn Chah said, when you begin contemplating, your mind feels calm, steady. If you're not sure what to contemplate, contemplate this body. Your relationship between your mind and body, what the body is, what it's composed of, 4 elements, 32 parts, the nature of the body, impermanent, changing, the suffering of the body, and the lack of self in this body. So if you're not sure what to contemplate, go to the body. But of course you can contemplate many other things, your mood, your changing mood, the changing thought patterns in your mind, the changing sense contact you're having, the feelings you're having, pleasant, unpleasant, neutral. There's plenty of area to contemplate. But you need to have that steadiness of mind so that you can pay attention to what is the object of your contemplation. So mindfulness and wisdom, they go hand in hand, support each other. So that's the last question tonight. We'll end now, but wish you all well for the coming days as we're still in lockdown. Winter weather is here. It may be more challenging because we're in week 2 of this current lockdown, so probably feeling restless. Many people are feeling anxious, some people feeling depressed. Like, what's the world coming to? You can't do what you want to do. But try and use some of these themes that we've been talking about tonight, practicing mindfulness, contemplating your experience rather than just getting lost in the moods all the time and reacting to things, particularly with aversion and frustration. Try to establish more mindfulness and contemplate these things. And this will help ease your mind out of some of the suffering that may be coming up at this time. So, may the blessings of the Buddha Dhamma Sangha guide you and protect you. And we'll talk again next time.
Dhamma